This is the second. So we've got three lectures, haven't we? We've had the portrait painting one. This is the landscape painting one, and then we've got abstract painting tomorrow at the same time. So I decided to split it into the three, seeing the best way of doing it. And you can see the title, From Nature's Beauty to Cultural Reflection, and that really sums up the whole lecture and one of the big issues for landscape painters, really. And the first slide I'll show you is we're going to have a historical kind of run through again, like we did with portraiture, but I just wanted to start off with the Thomas Cole painting from 1836. It's called the Oxbow, and it's a very famous painting. Thomas Cole was founder of the Hudson River School, very famous American school of painters. And it's this view after the thunderstorm, panorama of the Connecticut River Valley. And it's the classic sort of confrontation between wilderness and civilization. And it's that sort of like balance that everyone goes through with landscape, you know. How much do you show civilization and the warts and all bit? And how much do you just want to show wilderness and the beautiful planet doing its thing? And Thomas Cole's here is kind of like in between. So we've got people here. We've got, this is, you know, the thunderstorm. We've got an Oxbow Lake, which is kind of a natural phenomenon. Yet we've got fields here made by humans. So there's a little bit of humanity and quite a lot of wilderness. So you can see where his balance kind of is, okay? And like I say, that is a thing that we'll run through this lecture. Where does the painter sit on that continuum? But let's start off our historical journey. So the generally thought to be the first representation of landscape with paint is this thing called the lily fresco, which is in Santorini in Greece. Papyrus lilies growing in this wonderful shape, and then you've got the volcanoes and you've got swallows flying around the flowers. So we've got classic symbols of landscape within this room. And like all, you know, these are frescoes, a lot of early paintings are frescoes painted on walls. So you've got these lovely plaster walls giving this beautiful background color. And this one, you know, in particular, has become like this sort of installation space, hasn't it? It's very beautiful atmosphere, very sort of mud, earthy sort of tones. So yeah, thought to be the first landscape representation. And then during, you know, as we jump up the centuries, we'd have loads and loads of work going on in China based around landscape, and the East, you know, generally Japan, China. These kind of representations, sort of beautiful lines and delicate sort of shapes made with ink, normally with very, very, very kind of like wonderful technique, showing this sort of depth, and again painted on a, you know, non-white background, which I always think's really rather nice. We've got this brown sort of sepia paper on which the ink is added, okay? And interestingly, also we have this panoramic format, which again, you know, landscape does attract this, although not many people, very few contemporary painters paint landscape in this sort of format, which again is quite a surprising sort of thing. Whereas it seems to be like a natural place to sort of start with the format, really. And then jumping ahead, we're in the 16th century now. The great Flemish painters. This one's seen as a real watershed in the history of Western art, and some people have called it like the first modern landscape. And again, it's got that balance between the wonderful natural landscape and then man's intervention, humans' intervention here. The farming's going on, you know, they're having lunch. There's lots of depiction. It's almost like a documentary painting. And we'd call it, you know, the word pastoral is something we use a lot with landscape painting, pastoral landscape. And that generally means, you know, the sort of agriculture or people living in the country, enjoying the rural landscape, I guess. So lots of narrative painting as well. So again, within landscape, we get that. How much does he want to tell a story? How far do you go away from landscape, or do you show what happens on the landscape? So those are some of the decisions that landscape painters need to make. And this is a very famous painting by Claude Lorraine, 1682, 17th century. It's called Landscape with Ascania Shooting the Stag of Sylvia. This is a scene from Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. I think it's called Aeneid. And here we've got Ascanius shooting a stag that is actually the daughter of Sylvia, chief ranger to the Latian king. So this shooting actually provokes a war. So for the future site of Rome. So this is a big story, a big sort of like, a big incident really in terms of the development of Rome. This shooting of the stag here. So it's quite a big moment. So we've got a beautiful painting and we've got some drama going on. So again, not just the wonderful natural landscape as it exists. You know, we can talk about landscape painting all the time in terms of compositional rules. Claude Lorraine's a very, very good person to look at when you start talking about composition. And we can talk about the position of the horizon right on that sort of golden section, which is not a half, it's not a third, it's somewhere in between. And we've got kind of a bit of the rule of thirds there. So we've got things, beautiful balance. The stag is very prominent, balancing out some of the activity over here. So it's a beautiful, beautifully balanced composition. So ticks all the boxes. Moving on a bit, 19th century, early 19th century, we've got one of the masterpieces of the Romantic movement, and the painting that everyone uses really to talk about ideas of the sublime. So that's a term which we can take out of this lecture, sublime landscape, which means a landscape which is sort of awesome, a landscape which is threatening, it's quite dark, it's quite dangerous, yet it's very, very beautiful. So we're kind of drawn into this danger, but also repelled by it. And here we've got the hiker looking down on this sea of fog and the rocky landscape, a metaphor for, you know, a journey into the unknown. So it's this painting's in terms of an emblem of self-reflection, contemplation of life's path. And this would be a self-portrait, really. This would be Caspar Friedrich painting himself. And then in England, there was a lot of activity around this point, early 19th century, with landscape, and some classic images and paintings came out of it. One of them is, of course, Constable's The Hay Wain from 1821. Again, this bucolic pastoral scene of incredible peace and calmness, beautifully composed, you know, little bit of activity down here, the dog, the stuff going on the river, the beautiful clouds. Yeah, this is probably one of the most popular ever English paintings. This is the one you'll find in most people's houses on in frames or on table mats or mugs or whatever. But just leaping forward, we do have a contemporary version, which is the great Peter Kennard, who's a photomontagist. This is his version from 1980. So this is his Hay Wain with cruise missiles, just when the Americans were given permission to site cruise missiles in the UK. Peter Kennard did this, where he sort of despoiled kind of iconic image of Englishness with these huge American missiles. So that's Kennard's take on it, which is quite sort of funny, but also kind of like a bit worrying. Yeah, so we had Constable that time, early 19th century. Also Samuel Palmer, very important painter. Palmer's work is a lot more sort of magical and mystical, and this one sort of sums it up quite well, I think. Cornfield at Night and Evening Star from 1830. You've got a local person wandering with the staff, this really eerie light, and you've got this, the star is here, but the moon looks like there's some sort of eclipse going on. I'm not sure there is, but I think it kind of appears a little bit like that. So yeah, the shepherd this is, and his dog, a ridiculously big moon, bright scene. So it's a kind of a romantic sort of magical creation. So we're getting, I guess, with this one, a lot of the paintings you've seen so far have been more representational, I guess. So now we're getting a little bit more in terms of realism. Now we're getting a little bit more subjectivity, or the artist beginning to put their own stamp on what they're wanting to paint. So yeah, Constable, Palmer, and J.M.W. Turner, the three great landscape painters of the early 19th century to mid 19th century. And this is a point now where we've got some issues to deal with. Okay, so we've got the Industrial Revolution, we've got railways being built, we've got factories, we've got people working in factories in difficult conditions, we've got technological advancement, you know, on farms and in factories. So it's a kind of a bit of an uneasy time. So this painting, I think, sort of tries to sum up some of that strife, the romantic sort of strife within Turner. So he's kind of got his beautiful landscape and the elements there, but then he's got this sort of train, locomotive, black, you know, coming out over the bridge. Brunel's Maidenhead Railway Bridge, this is. So there's that tension beginning to appear now between the man-made and the natural landscape. Okay, so important time for British English painting there. But then, of course, it gets taken over quite considerably by what was going on in Europe, in France in particular, because you've got a lot of the great painters towards the end of the 19th century. You've got a lot of the great painters dealing with landscape. So, and one of those, of course, is Paul Cézanne, working in Aix-en-Provence, you know, down around the areas where Van Gogh was working as well. And he painted the Mont Sainte-Victoire, and he painted it many, many times in many, many different ways. So this is one of the first examples of somebody using subject matter to sort of explore paint. So he's painting it from all sorts of different angles, in all sorts of different lights, with all sorts of different techniques. So he's kind of seen it as a kind of vehicle for trying out different techniques and different processes. Okay, so there's an excellent series. You can see the changing of the light, the mood. I think there's about 30 paintings in all. Well worth looking at them. We can see the cubist idea. So again, we're not getting that really misty sort of impressionist idea. We're not getting the real detailed realist. We're getting some form of cubism where we can see different angles emerging, especially in Mont Sainte-Victoire and in the trees here. And at the same sort of time, we've got the wonderful Van Gogh painting in around Arles and the south of France. This is the very important wheat field with crows from 1890. And we've got, yeah, turmoil. I mean, his brushstrokes just seem to show turmoil, don't they? We know that. We know his situation as a story. But even so, it looks kind of like it's tension within the landscape. And the crows, of course, are adding to that. So we know Van Gogh so well, don't we? But this is a classic. And then American landscape started appearing. Georgia O'Keeffe, who we know for flowers mainly, possibly, did a lot of landscapes. So her similar style for the flowers, she's applied to the landscape. So lots of form, lots of exaggerated color. So this is a very personal interpretation of the landscape that inspired her in New Mexico. And the mountains are sort of bluey, but she's made them very bright blue. And the foreground here with the earth would have been quite red. She's made it very red. So she's exaggerating landscape properties. And again, I want to talk about the relationship between photography and painting, because you can't really get away with it in portraiture and landscape, to be fair. So, you know, photography was becoming very, very sophisticated by this point. And we've got the ability through photography to record an amazingly detailed landscape and record light beautifully. So we've got a much more realist, objective view of the world. And Ansel Adams was the kind of master of that approach. And this is his famous Yosemite picture, Clearing Winter Storm. So we can see, painting is never going to be able to do this quite so easily as photography can. So maybe painting is having to respond to that. But we do get in America still got some sort of a different form of realism, I guess, coming. And this is the famous realist painter Andrew Wyeth. This is his piece called Winterfields. And again, we've got a narrative coming in now. We've got something to say, saying something about human intervention. So we've got little houses here, little parts of farm buildings, which are taking, without those, it just becomes something very much about a little bit more like a sublime sort of landscape with the dead crow and stuff. But here, this just brings in that sort of human side of things. And he has used that sort of panoramic landscape, panoramic format, which I think is quite interesting. And also, this is kind of like the beginning of painters focusing on their locale, where they live, the local areas, or places that are important to them. So they're not sort of choosing to go to extraordinary wilderness to sort of capture the incredible. They're actually focusing on their own environment. So the subtle everyday landscape that they're familiar with. And photography, again, late 1900, late 20th century, quite a big leap in that there were a group of photographers called the New Topographic Photographers who decided to just do this very objective, factual recording of the landscape in America. It's very, very bleak, and I don't think you'd pay to put them on your wall, but still it's important photography because it's recording changes in the American landscape and changes in the way it's used. So lots of new housing developments going up. And just that kind of very factual recording, but nearly always showing the wonderful natural landscape that miles and miles of that there are in the American West, contrasting that with the new buildings. So photography again is kind of like doing something slightly different to painting at certain points during its development. And then we're moving forward now, and to Peter Doig, who's generally thought to be one of the most important landscape painters painting today. And we can see a shift again from the spectacular or the big narratives, the big vistas, to these kind of paintings. So this is a classic Peter Doig, which is called Swamped. It has a canoe series. They're really, really very unsettling and very sort of strange. So they exist in that strange sort of place. They're like sort of dreams, yet there's elements of reality in there. Strange sort of symbols, strange reflections, the dark forest. So always like sort of like hinting at something, some story or some, but never quite showing it fully. So they exist in that very, very in between sort of space, I suppose, is fair to say. But then we'd say photography, and we can talk about photography again because this is Burtynsky's nickel tailings photographs. So they're taken from an aerial perspective. And again, we got photography being more objective, showing fact a bit more. Peter Doig's pictures, they're completely made up, really. We wouldn't look at that and say, oh, that exists, it's fact. But we would look at the Burtynsky and say, actually, maybe this does exist. And it's worrying, isn't it? It's kind of like, it's unsettling because this is the aftermath of mining and smelting. Okay, so this is pollution. Yeah, definitely pollution. This is chemical, and this is an ecological reality. So it's trouble. And one of the questions would be, can landscape painting show us these kind of issues? And then one of my favorite landscape painters of current times is George Shaw, the British painter. Again, somebody who is painting this is Coventry, where he grew up in the 70s and 80s, and he's looking at trying to find that beauty within the mundane. And it's difficult to see here, but his paintings are made with enamel paint. So they're very sort of thick paint, sort of glossy, with a very certain texture, and very unusual. So if you get a chance to see them in a gallery, I'd urge you to go. They're very small, but are very intimate sort of paintings. But yeah, he's seeing a beauty there in the everyday. And a lot of that is to do with his connection with the place. Back to photography, and we've got Gursky, who's kind of one of the art world's sort of superstars. Gursky makes these huge photographs, very painterly, and huge prints, which are, you know, massive prints in a gallery. Often showing people and humanity as like little ants, insignificant ants in the landscape. But I think why I want to put this in is because it's digitized. So Gursky often repeats copies and pastes. So a lot of these cows and stuff will be duplicated in this picture. Okay. And again, just showing, I think, the difference between a medium like photography and what's possible with that, and painting and what's possible with that. And of course, David Hockney, we need to include in here, probably one of the most best, you know, thought of landscape painters. Huge, again, painting his Yorkshire landscape, his beloved Yorkshire countryside, which he's kind of drawn to more and more. And this is sort of like a Fauvist colour expression of a landscape, isn't it? Very, very subjective, very, very kind of like exaggerated. I'm not sure there's a message in it. It's a lot of landscape painting is very much about painting. You know, it's about what I can do with color, what I can do with paint, what I can do with light, composition, all those sorts of things. And I think Hockney's falls very much within that. And this is the great Chinese painter Liu Xiaodong, and this is his the Hotam project. And we've got, again, this is one of those ones which is, it's kind of realism. It's not glamorizing the landscape. This is a landscape which is a mine. So we've got loose rocks and dust. But this is where people dig for jade, okay? And we've got this strange tension here between, like, a couple seem to be promenading together amongst this sort of ruin. So it's kind of like social comment, but it's also a comment about the landscape that we raid, I suppose, for our minerals and our wealth. And then the final one I'm going to show you is Rush Baker, the American painter. And he's, again, combining the two, issue-based historical image with a more contemporary sort of critique of it. And a lot of landscape paintings these days does exist in this sort of area, where it's using paint to try and, I suppose, sow doubt in some ways, doubt at what the landscape is all about. This one is called Gettysburg, Untitled Gettysburg Landscape. And in the back, you can see it's a print, basically. Paper prints of the historical landscape of the Gettysburg. Gettysburg was, there was a battle, American Civil War. Yeah, so this is a landscape, a historical landscape, which is the scarred sort of landscape. So very historically significant. And he's used this kind of, I think, this sort of window, this blurry window affair idea in terms of the composition to sort of, yeah, reflect on memory, I suppose, the past and the big things that have happened, and how the landscape is so important to that. So yeah, that's a look through. I think we can say, can't we, the landscape painting is going to get more complicated. Landscape painting is much less about showing a beauty. It's becoming more political. It's becoming more sort of issue based, but also it's sort of about painting, which is a difficult thing to say. Anyway, let's just finish off. So the summary, here's Thomas Coles, just to anchor us in that tension that exists, the Oxbow painting. So it can simply show nice scenery or communicate ideas about the world, culture and humanity. Second point, yeah, compared to photography, landscape painting is always more subjective. So we always know it's a construction, really, although some work is very sort of realist, photorealist, but that's rare. We know the viewpoint of the artist is in there somewhere. And that question I touched upon when I showed you the Burtinsky photograph. Can landscape painting powerfully represent the current environmental crisis? I don't know if it can really, because we know the artist's making up, whereas with a photographer, we get an idea that it's sort of reality. So maybe the photography is the medium that's going to be able to do that. I don't know. And then there's that borderline, when does a landscape become something else? So could it just be, can it just be an abstract painting? We might see that tomorrow in the other lecture. Or what about a narrative painting, a story? There's these sort of places that landscape moves into. And then the final point, similar sort of thing, summing things up. Is landscape painting at its best when it asks the viewer to consider their relationship to the planet, or when it shows us the extraordinary beauty of the natural landscape? And obviously that question, I mean, most of it is doing a bit of both, I guess. So, and when we talk about beauty of the natural landscape, we talk about beauty in a very wide sense, which could be George Shaw's dirty old car park or Peter Doig's sort of pond with a canoe on it. Beauty is very much in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? Anyway, there's some questions for you. Landscape is complex, and it's not quite as simple as just a beautiful painting of a beautiful world. Okay, we'll leave it at that. I hope that was useful. I was having trouble sticking this to 20 minutes because there's always so much to talk about. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy your evening, and we shall hopefully see you again tomorrow for the third one, which is abstraction. Thank you all very much.